As the royal family prepared for its most anticipated holiday gathering, one glaring absence sent shockwaves through palace walls. Princess Beatrice, known for her compassion, had reportedly refused to spend Christmas with her father. The snub wasn't a scheduling mishap, it was personal, and behind it was a scandal she could no longer ignore. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What began as whispers quickly turned into confirmations. Sources close to royal planning teams revealed that Beatrice's name had been quietly removed from the Windsor guest list weeks before the holiday. While official statements kept the tone diplomatic, the truth behind the scenes was far more cutting. Beatrice, it was said, made her decision with resolve. There were no tears, no apologies, only clarity. Her Christmas would be spent away from the royal estate. Not with Andrew, not in the shadow of scandal, and certainly not in pretense. Those within the firm had hoped to manage it quietly, but the optics proved impossible to control. Andrew was reportedly blindsided. According to insiders, he'd been under the impression that his eldest daughter, despite recent tensions, would ultimately choose tradition. After all, family unity had always been a shield in times of crisis. But this time, there was no last-minute reconciliation. There was no olive branch extended. And what shocked many within the palace wasn't just Beatrice's absence, but the reason behind it. The relationship between father and daughter had deteriorated long before the press caught on. It had been months of cold silences, unanswered messages, and private family discussions that ended with more pain than progress. Within the royal household, the divide became palpable. Some senior aides argued that Beatrice's decision could spark a media storm, further destabilizing an already fragile image of royal cohesion. Others believed she was right to distance herself, especially with a new scandal looming over Andrew's name. Regardless of personal loyalties, everyone understood that this was no longer just a private family matter. This was a royal statement, and the palace knew it couldn't keep it contained. An initial attempt to smother the story failed. Details leaked. Speculation grew. Soon, headlines declared what the palace wouldn't, that Princess Beatrice had chosen to spend Christmas far from the shadows of her father's disgrace. As the public caught wind of the unfolding drama, it wasn't just shock that followed, it was a wave of divided emotion. Was this a daughter's betrayal or an act of personal courage? And as royal watchers debated, one thing became devastatingly clear. The House of York was no longer united. But to understand why Beatrice made the decision, we must trace the quiet storm building behind palace doors. Just when the dust seemed to settle, new allegations surrounding Prince Andrew surfaced, dark, complex, and impossible to ignore. And this time, it wasn't just the public who reacted. Members of his own family began stepping back. It began quietly. A court document, previously sealed under international protection, was suddenly unsealed and referenced in a filing from a foreign jurisdiction. It didn't name Andrew directly, but the context was explosive. Dates, locations, and veiled language pointed toward his past, and immediately the press latched on. Within hours, media outlets across Europe and the U.S. began speculating. Was this connected to the infamous case he had long tried to put behind him? Was this the beginning of something far more damaging? The tone shifted from rumor to revelation. News anchors who once spoke cautiously began using words like fresh testimony and legal vulnerability. The implications weren't just reputational, they were potentially criminal. Prince Andrew's legal team moved swiftly but not convincingly. A vague denial was issued, dismissing the stories as mischaracterized and irresponsible. But what was noticeably absent was any direct rebuttal of the underlying claims. There was no commitment to transparency, no promise to cooperate, just silence wrapped in formality. And that silence was deafening. It didn't calm the storm, it fed it. The palace, blindsided by the sudden escalation, convened internal meetings. Crisis protocols were dusted off. Advisors debated strategies. Some argued for a full severance from Andrew's public visibility. Others, more traditional in thinking, insisted that the family should show unity, but cracks were already forming. Behind closed doors, Beatrice was said to be visibly distressed. Those close to her revealed that she had hoped naively, perhaps that the worst was in the past, that the family could quietly rebuild. But this new development reopened wounds she had never fully healed. The quiet shame she had carried for years had returned in full force, now sharper and more public than ever. Friends claimed she was shaken to her core, especially as the media began once again linking her name, through no fault of her own, to a father mired in legal suspicion. This time, it felt different, not just more public, but more isolating. And within the firm, conversations shifted. No longer was the question whether Beatrice would support Andrew, but how to protect her from further reputational damage. Even seasoned royal aides recognized the shift in tone. Beatrice, previously seen as a loyal daughter trying to navigate impossible terrain, was now a high-profile figure being dragged back into a narrative she no longer had the strength or desire to endure. Discussions intensified. Could there be a formal distancing? Could Beatrice be repositioned entirely? While some pushed for a slow fade, others believed a decisive break was necessary, not for optics, but for her emotional preservation. But for Beatrice, this wasn't about strategy. It was about emotional survival. Behind her public poise, Beatrice was drowning in a storm of loyalty and heartbreak. Torn between familial duty and her own values, she spent months wrestling with a decision no daughter ever wants to make. From the moment the scandal first shattered the House of York, Beatrice had clung to the hope that some version of redemption was still possible. Not just for her father, but for the dignity of their family name. For years, she stood beside Andrew, not with blind allegiance, but with a daughter's desperate desire to preserve something human beneath the headlines. In private, she offered support, pleaded for transparency, and urged him to act with accountability. But as the months passed, and the denials piled higher than the evidence, something inside her began to break. The weight of her silence had become suffocating, and no matter how publicly she smiled, the damage was bleeding into every corner of her life. According to close friends, Beatrice eventually sought professional help to navigate the pressure. The emotional toll of defending someone she no longer fully trusted had begun to erode her well-being. Palace aides noticed a change. Her appearances became more measured, her presence more distant. Behind the scenes, she confided in Princess Eugenie. The sisters had always been close, but even that bond began to strain under the weight of what to do next. Late-night conversations reportedly turned from whispers to tearful debates about how far they were willing to go to protect their futures from being chained to their father's past. One wanted to shield him, the other wanted to step away. But both were exhausted by the emotional war no royal title could shield them from. It wasn't only her sister who offered a listening ear. Princess Catherine, who had quietly watched the York sisters struggle under a scrutiny she knew all too well, was said to have extended quiet counsel. She didn't push, she didn't judge. She simply reminded Beatrice that doing what was right and doing what was expected were rarely the same thing inside the monarchy. For Beatrice, the words landed like a lifeline. She began to understand that protecting her peace wasn't betrayal, it was survival. And survival, in a family like theirs, was never guaranteed. Her final decision came not with fanfare but with a confession. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she confided in a senior royal someone known for discretion and calm. She explained the inner conflict, the fear of public backlash, the ache of walking away from a father who once seemed larger than life. And then, she made it clear. She would not be attending Christmas at Windsor. It wasn't an act of vengeance. It wasn't a political maneuver. It was the only decision she could live with. But while Beatrice was quietly unraveling, Andrew's behavior suggested he hadn't yet realized what was coming. While the world speculated, Andrew remained convinced his daughter would stand by him until the very moment she didn't. His inner circle now fears it's a misjudgment from which he may never recover. In private, Andrew behaved as though nothing fundamental had shifted. He continued moving through carefully arranged social circles, attending low-profile gatherings and private dinners, insisting he was simply biding his time until the public mood softened. Those around him described a man clinging to the belief that family loyalty would eventually eclipse scandal. He spoke of Beatrice as though the strain between them was temporary, the kind of emotional turbulence that inevitably resolves itself in royal families hardened by decades of scrutiny. To him, she was overwhelmed, sensitive, perhaps swayed by external pressures, but never actually gone. He could not, or would not, imagine otherwise. Yet reality was already diverging sharply from the fantasy he tried to hold on to. His appearances grew noticeably thinner in attendance, with fewer relatives willing to be seen by his side. Invitations arrived, then quietly evaporated. Conversations shortened. Polite smiles became the only shield left. Insiders whispered that attempts to contact Beatrice were often met with silence. Calls unanswered, messages left hanging. She was present in his life only as absence, and that absence began to echo louder than any words he might have wanted from her. Still, he insisted to confidants that she simply needed space, refusing to consider that her withdrawal was, in fact, a decision. Compounding everything, Charles and Camilla reportedly intervened, not with dramatic statements, but with strategic caution. They requested limited visibility for Andrew during holiday events, a phrase that sounded administrative yet carried the sting of exile. Appear only when necessary, speak only when required, fade wherever possible. It was both command and warning, and deep down Andrew knew it. The monarchy was closing ranks, carefully separating itself from the one figure who threatened to pull them back into the shadows they'd struggled so hard to escape. The press, ever hungry, sensed the shift before the palace admitted it. Rumors of tension between father and daughter began surfacing first as subtle speculation, then as bold headlines. Cameras waited for any glimpse of them together, and every non-appearance added another layer to the narrative. For a man who once believed prestige could outlast scandal, the realization was devastating. Not even royal blood could shield him from the consequences of choices he still refused to confront. Frustration turned inward. Desperation followed, and those closest to him began to see a man not simply embattled but increasingly isolated, trapped between pride and the fear of losing the one bond he assumed was unbreakable. But it was the official confirmation of Beatrice's Christmas plans that turned quiet tension into national headlines. The news broke just days before Christmas. Princess Beatrice would not be joining her family at Windsor. The absence, once whispered, became the headline. And with it, the royal silence spoke volumes. It began with a discreet confirmation buried in a single sentence from a palace source. Beatrice, it said, would be spending the holidays privately with her husband and child. There were no further details, no mention of Windsor, no reference to tradition, but for seasoned royal watchers, it was enough. The subtext was deafening. Within hours, headlines erupted across major tabloids and global outlets. Beatrice Snubs, Royal Christmas, read one. A palace rift confirmed, read another. What had been speculation for weeks now stood as fact. The eldest daughter of Prince Andrew had drawn a very public line. Anonymous insiders wasted no time fanning the flames. One reportedly described her decision as a clear personal choice, noting it had been communicated well in advance and received with a mixture of disappointment and reluctant understanding. To some within the palace, the move felt like betrayal. To others, it was a long overdue assertion of boundaries. Either way, it was undeniable Beatrice had removed herself from the royal optics of unity. And in doing so, she lit a match under the powder keg that had been quietly building all year. The public reaction was immediate and deeply polarized. Supporters flooded social media praising her courage. Hashtags like #IStandWithBeatrice and #BoundariesAreRoyal trended across platforms. They saw her not as rebellious, but as principled. A woman protecting her peace in the face of a legacy she never chose. But not everyone agreed. Critics questioned her timing, her silence, her loyalty. Some accused her of turning her back on family when they needed her most. Others claimed she was merely distancing herself to preserve her own reputation, a move they viewed as cold and strategic. The divide wasn't just inside the palace anymore, it was now playing out across every screen in the country. Meanwhile, the tabloids began constructing their own timelines. Retrospective pieces began to surface, detailing every awkward encounter, every missed appearance, every silent moment between Beatrice and her father over the past year. Each detail, no matter how minor, was re-examined under a new lens. Private dinners she skipped, smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. And suddenly, what once seemed subtle now appeared orchestrated. A slow unraveling of connection, culminating in a refusal that had become impossible to ignore. Yet even as the press speculated and commentators debated, Beatrice's team remained unmoved. No rebuttals, no clarifications, no spin. The message was clear: she would not be participating in the circus. She would not feed the headlines. And in doing so, she made the moment even more powerful. Her silence didn't weaken the story. It gave it gravity. And within that gravity, the monarchy felt a subtle shift. But what the public didn't see were the private maneuvers unfolding behind closed royal gates. Inside the halls of Windsor, lines were being drawn. Some quietly backed Beatrice. Others stood frozen in royal paralysis. And through it all, one question echoed. Could the family ever come back from this? The fallout of Beatrice's Christmas absence spread like smoke through the royal household, not with drama or shouting, but with a heavy silence that said everything. There were no public confrontations, no open declarations of division, but every look, every rearranged seating plan, every whispered comment behind heavy doors revealed the truth: Windsor was fractured. The pain wasn't just public, it was personal, deep, and spreading. Princess Eugenie, once inseparable from her sister, found herself trapped between loyalty to Beatrice and a quiet sense of obligation to a father who had raised them both. Insiders revealed that she had been making calls late into the night, trying to mediate, trying to soften the edges of a situation spiraling out of control. But even she had begun to understand this was no longer something she could fix. At the top of the monarchy, Queen Camilla and King Charles were focused on containment. Stability, not justice, had become the priority. There was no appetite for further division, no room for scandal to overshadow the institution. Sources close to the king claimed his message was clear: manage optics, preserve the firm, avoid further embarrassment. But that directive proved increasingly difficult to execute, because Beatrice had not lashed out, she had not leaked, she had not spoken. Her silence was not defiant, it was devastatingly dignified, and that made it all the more powerful. Meanwhile, Prince Edward and Sophie, long known for their quiet loyalty and emotional steadiness, were said to be sympathetic toward Beatrice's position. Privately, they supported her decision, understanding better than most the emotional toll of playing roles that often demanded sacrifice without relief. Their support didn't make headlines, but it mattered. It showed that beneath the performance of unity, there were those in the family who saw Beatrice's act not as betrayal, but as bravery. William, too, reportedly offered quiet respect. Though never directly involved, his position as future king made his stance influential. He didn't involve himself in the drama, but when asked privately, those close to him say he understood her choice, and perhaps more importantly, he didn't push back against it. In a family that has long demanded silence in the name of duty, his restraint was a statement in itself. Prince Andrew, however, was nowhere to be seen. As Christmas neared, he pulled further and further from view. Once a central figure in family photo ops, he now avoided all major appearances. When the official Christmas Day photo was released, it was glaring he was absent. For the first time in years, there was no attempt to include him on the periphery. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. This was a new royal order, and he was no longer a part of it. But while the institution struggled to maintain order, Beatrice was finding unexpected strength in forging her own path. For years, she was defined by proximity to her father's controversy, but now, Princess Beatrice was reclaiming her identity not in a press release, but through action, silence, and one very deliberate absence. In the aftermath of her decision to distance herself, Beatrice did not retreat, she redefined. Rather than engage with the noise or clarify her stance, she turned inward, focusing her energy on work that reflected her own values, not the shadows of legacy she had once tried so hard to carry. Her presence became more grounded in substance, steadily committing herself to education and dyslexia awareness charities, while prioritizing a quieter life with her husband Eduardo and their daughter. It was a sharp contrast to the spectacle her family had become entangled in, and it didn't go unnoticed. By removing herself from scandal and rejecting opportunistic headlines, Beatrice began to rebuild something far more powerful than public sympathy. She built trust. Royal watchers observed a shift in tone surrounding her narrative. She no longer appeared as a peripheral figure trying to survive the weight of her family name. Instead, she emerged as someone who had made a difficult choice and lived with it, gracefully and without theatricality. Those close to her say she felt relieved in stepping away from the toxicity, but not without cost. There was sadness too, a private mourning of a relationship that had once been unconditional. But Beatrice understood what few in her position ever admit. Sometimes, boundaries are love, and survival, at its core, demands truth. Among those who knew her best, there were quiet reflections on past conversations with the late Queen Elizabeth conversations that had helped shape her compass in ways only now becoming visible. The Queen, it was said, had always viewed Beatrice as introspective, steady, and deeply loyal, but also burdened. Her advice had been simple, almost cryptic: be yourself, and serve from there. In recent months, those words had resurfaced in Beatrice's memory with greater clarity, and now, as she stepped further into her own spotlight, they served as a quiet mantra, guiding her away from obligation and toward purpose. More than ever, royal commentators began referring to Beatrice as a figure of generational accountability. She was part of the transition not just in age, but in ethos. The monarchy, if it wished to survive another century, could no longer hide behind silence or protect those who refused to change. Beatrice's decision to step back was not rebellion, it was realignment. And for many, it signaled the emergence of a different kind of royal, one who didn't chase approval, but demanded honesty. Some even suggested that her role might evolve into something far more influential, not with grandeur or titles, but with the quiet power of moral clarity. As the monarchy continues to evolve, she is being watched not for scandal, but for her ability to navigate it, for her consistency, her strength, and the silent message her actions continue to send. And yet, even as Beatrice found her voice, a shadow still lingered, one that Andrew might not escape. When a father loses the trust of his daughter, there are no palace walls strong enough to contain the consequences. For Prince Andrew, this wasn't just a scandal, it was a reckoning, and he was utterly unprepared. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It was slow, unrelenting, and most painfully, silent. Princess Beatrice's decision to withhold her presence that Christmas spoke volumes. There was no need for statements, no interviews, no dramatic distancing in the public eye. Her absence from Andrew's side was louder than any condemnation. Within palace circles, it was interpreted as a line drawn in private, a daughter who had reached the limits of what love could shield. It wasn't rebellion. It was heartbreak. And in that heartbreak, the public saw something far more powerful than any legal verdict. A family no longer willing to protect its own at the cost of its future. As Beatrice stepped away, the consequences for Andrew became more than reputational. Royal insiders began to whisper that his access to family properties had been reassessed. Invitations once extended without hesitation were now subject to review. There were no formal bans, only the chill of logistical complications, the slow erosion of status through silence. Wealthy allies, once eager to associate with the prince, began vanishing from view. Their donations, their support, their connections quietly vanished into thin air. A once formidable circle of protectors now seemed fractured, unwilling to risk their legacies by standing too close to his. But perhaps the most telling blow was the shifting tone inside the House of Windsor itself. As Charles and Camilla doubled down on projecting an image of stability, Andrew became a symbol of everything the monarchy could no longer afford. He was no longer spoken of as a working royal, but as a liability, an anomaly. His name didn't come up in public briefings, and his presence was consistently avoided at engagements where optics mattered most. And then came the Christmas portrait, a moment the royal family has long used as a symbol of unity. For the first time in years, Andrew was missing. Not ill, not away, just absent. And in that absence, a brutal message was delivered. The page had turned. Yet those closest to him say he still clings to a belief that the worst will pass, that if he waits long enough, the tides will shift. Friends describe him as devastated, but also unchanged. He continues to insist, privately, that his version of events has not been fairly heard. But the court of public opinion has moved on, and with it, so has much of the institution he once belonged to. Legal pressures remain quietly in the background, resurfacing every few months like a storm on the horizon. And while the palace refuses to speak on matters of ongoing litigation, the reality is undeniable. Prince Andrew is no longer protected by legacy. He is adrift, clinging to a name that no longer shields him. And yet, in the aftermath of scandal and silence, a new royal dynamic was being born, one led by women who refused to be silent. Princess Beatrice's stand wasn't just personal, it was transformative. In refusing to look away, she set a precedent the monarchy couldn't ignore. A future once shaped by silence was now led by quiet defiance. Across the British public, something shifted. No longer were royal women simply seen as ceremonial figures draped in tradition and diplomacy, they were viewed as the conscience of the crown. In Beatrice's subtle but seismic decision to distance herself from her father's scandal, a line was drawn that reshaped the emotional power balance within the monarchy. She didn't shout. She didn't campaign. She simply said nothing, and in doing so, said everything. Her absence wasn't interpreted as retreat. It was seen as resistance. And in a family that had long prized unity over individuality, that resistance rewrote the rules. The ripple didn't stop with her. Princess Catherine, already admired for her poise, began to be spoken of as a pillar of generational continuity. Princess Anne's lifelong dedication, once taken for granted, was now regarded with new appreciation. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, long underestimated, found her quiet fortitude finally recognised. And Beatrice, once overshadowed by headlines and family burdens, stood among them, not as a victim of legacy but as an architect of integrity. The emotional lifeblood of the monarchy had moved. It no longer flowed from protocol, it came from principle. Meanwhile, Prince Andrew's legacy became increasingly ghost-like. Once woven into the royal fabric, his name began to vanish from the collective memory of institutional pride. Not by decree, not by denouncement, but by omission. The firm no longer needed to explain his absence. The absence explained itself. The younger generation, especially those watching the monarchy evolve in real time, found themselves aligning not with excuses, but with accountability. It was Beatrice's refusal to normalize what could no longer be defended that became the reference point. A royal, born into privilege, choosing moral clarity over public comfort. Behind the scenes, palace insiders spoke of a monarchy, learning perhaps too late that survival in the modern world isn't about controlling perception, but aligning it with values the public shares. The firm, once rigid in its refusal to bend, had begun to pivot, not because of scandal, but because of how the women within its walls responded to scandal. It wasn't a press strategy. It wasn't a rebranding campaign. It was a transformation forged in personal anguish and quiet strength. And Christmas, once a symbol of perfect royal unity, would now forever carry the tension of who wasn't there and why. Because ultimately, that was the point. The story wasn't about division. It was about evolution. The monarchy, for all its rituals and silence, had been forced to confront what it could no longer shelter. The gates of tradition had been cracked open, not by rebellion, but by resolve. And as the royal gates close on another turbulent year, one truth stands firm. This family's legacy will now be shaped not by what they protect, but by what they refuse to tolerate. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.